Hi, everyone. Good morning to our viewers in the United States. Good afternoon to everyone watching from Europe. My name is Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. And I'm delighted to welcome you for this event in coordination with the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group to highlight their newly released report, The Suspicious Virus, Conspiracies, and COVID-19 in the Balkans. The COVID 19 pandemic has upended lives and disrupted societies around the world. The challenges we face are historic, from lockdowns and stay at home orders to long term economic downturns. In the midst of this crisis, bad actors have seized the opportunity to create confusion, exacerbate divisions, and undermine critical information and trust through conspiracy theories and disinformation. We've seen COVID 19 conspiracies take hold on both sides of the Atlantic, threatening to complicate an already daunting crisis and raising hard questions. How would this impact vaccine distribution? What will be the long term impact on our democracies and institutions? What will a post COVID 19 future look like? Navigating these challenges is difficult but critical, and especially in countries where democratic institutions are newer and thus more vulnerable, and such is the case in the Western Balkans. Here at the Atlantic, we're deeply committed to advancing a democratic, secure, and prosperous Western Balkans firmly anchored to the Euro Atlantic community. Through our Balkans Forward initiative, we provide analysis on regional development, host strategy and policy recommendation sessions, and regularly convene with delegations, actors, and leaders to have timely and important conversations on the region and its relationship to the United States and the European Union. In July, in this respect, we hosted the Western Balkans Partnership Summit to facilitate concrete steps toward greater economic cooperation and stimulate the region's post COVID 19 economic recovery. And for those of you who followed the work of the Atlantic Council, you also know how much the fight against disinformation and misinformation is critical to our work, especially through our digital forensics research lab. It will be difficult enough to recover from COVID 19, but restoring public trust in institutions and managing geopolitical competition in the Western Balkans will require diligence, engagement from regional policymakers and the Euro Atlantic partners. This is a critical moment for the Balkans and the transatlantic communities. Together, we can weather COVID 19, navigate its challenges, and maintain the Balkans' forward progress. And this is really our priority here at the Atlantic Council. And we consider that the next few years with the Biden administration can also provide an incredible opportunity to strengthen transatlantic cooperation in the region. So, in this context, I'm thrilled to welcome our panel of experts from the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group to discuss their research report, their recommendations for policymakers to best address these issues. And with that, I'm glad to hand the floor to our friend Tim Judah to moderate our panel. Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's a great honor to be able to do this panel, to moderate this panel. In preparation, I kind of jotted a few things down on the back of an envelope, conspiracies that I could think of literally off the top of my head. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, the British royal family being reptiles from outer space, the Reichstag fire leading to the Enabling Act for enabling Hitler to consolidate power, or later Hitler retiring to live peacefully in South America. And then in closer to our own time, of course, conspiracies about Ukraine, that Nazis were behind the Maidan revolution, and in Syria, that the White Helmets were or are an Al-Qaeda front organization fronted by George Soros. I mean, there really seems to be kind of no end of conspiracy theories and literally just crazy stuff that people believe. But the Balkans in particular have been in our times have been kind of vulnerable to conspiracy theories. I remember very clearly as a journalist in the 90s, as the wars began, all sorts of kind of weird conspiracy theories about the Vatican. The Vatican Islamic plot to destroy Yugoslavia, or whatever it was, and unfortunately, those conspiracy theories have carried on into our time, and in our time that means, of course, COVID. Now, probably you haven't read this new report by the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, but I advise everybody to do so. And to tell you the truth, it's really horrendous reading. I mean, not only that people believe the most bizarre and crazy things, but perhaps most worrying of all, that a lot more people believe crazy things than other Europeans and people in the West in general. But we've got a panel here to discuss this and to tell us what the findings are. And the findings are based on opinion polls done by, commissioned by the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, who commissioned Ipsos to do the polling in the 6 non-EU Western Balkan countries, the Western Balkan 6. The moving force behind this report was Dr. Florian Bieber, who's the coordinator of BiEPAG, Balkans in Policy Advisory Group, and who also runs the Center for Southeast European Studies at Graz University in Austria. Florian, just pick out the most important figures from the report. I mean, what are the most important things that that we need to know that you've discovered from the opinion polling that you've done?
Thanks, Tim. Just to pick out a few things which are striking, maybe the most important figure is that just a bit more than 3/4 of those surveyed in the Western Balkans across the countries believe either to some degree or a lot in any of 5 conspiracy theories we've asked them about related to COVID-19, whether it's engineered in a Chinese lab, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry spreading it, or whether it's Bill Gates trying to chip the population or 5G technology being responsible. So any of those 3/4 or 77.1% believe to some degree in that, which is a much higher share than we see elsewhere in Europe. And then linked to that is, if we look at the, break it down, we can identify that basically half of those believe in one of the kind of less intense theories, and a third in the more outlandish ones, such as the link with 5G, or that Bill Gates is spreading it to microchip the population. So that's, I think, what is the most worrying indicator, and it's much higher than similar surveys for North America or Europe. And that translates to the willingness to get vaccinated. So if we're asking people, would they be vaccinated in most of Europe, and there was also a similar Ipsos global survey done at the same time as ours, that there's a majority in most countries, sometimes a very strong one, sometimes a slight one, but there is a majority in favor of getting vaccinated. In the Balkans, it's the other way around. There's a majority against getting vaccinated. It's 53.4% would rather not get vaccinated, and only 39.2% who would like to get vaccinated. And that is strongly linked to the belief in conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories have a direct impact on public health policies, also on the belief that there's fake news out there and that they're consuming it. It has all kinds of linkages on how people see themselves in the region. So these are, I think, the kind of key findings we could draw out from the study.
Great, but before we move on, though, you've just mentioned that that people believe in conspiracy theories in the Western Balkans more than in the rest of Europe or the US. But could you? There are some. You do have some more specific numbers about that. Can you just give us an idea of, like, how much more do people believe in basically crazy stuff than other people in Europe or North America?
I think, roughly in most surveys for North America and Western Europe, or most of Europe, roughly a quarter of the population subscribe to these conspiracy theories. And this number is basically 3 times higher in the Western Balkans. Again, the questions vary, but the number is significantly, more than double, we can certainly say, higher in the region. We're looking at that in the kind of European trends, and also the kind of classic patterns we're seeing, that people have a better education, believe less in conspiracy theories, does not pan out. They believe maybe in different conspiracies, but that belief holds strong across gender, across education, and across other demographic indicators where you would expect some variation in most other countries where you do actually see that.
Great. Well, we'll come back to that. But now I'd like to sort of hand over to your colleague, Tena Prelec. You're in Trieste at the moment, and you're research fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University. Tena, would you like to sort of pick up and tell us what's the most important finding for you from the report that you've been working on, and from the opinion polls that you've done?
Certainly, thank you, Tim. So one important finding, I think, is the fact that education and age and gender and even the urban-rural divide does not actually have much of an impact in terms of how much people believe in conspiracy theories or not. Whereas something that we found is that geopolitical cleavages, so geopolitics and geopolitical narratives, may actually play some role. We've seen that Serb respondents from Serbia and also ethnic Serbs from other Western Balkan countries are distinctly more favorably inclined towards China, for instance, than other respondents. So to put that in perspective, I would quote an episode that occurred to me just a few days ago, which is that I published a column at a web portal, a website called European Western Balkans, basically discussing the challenges standing in front of the new government of Montenegro. And I went to great lengths to put that in perspective and to be objective about it, and to also highlight the potential challenges. Now, just a few hours later, so the column was published in the morning, in the afternoon, there was already an article on a website in Montenegro that basically titled, Europe is sending a warning to the new governing coalition and is asking them to reject Russian nationalism and the Serbian influence. So what happened here? Basically, what I wrote as something that was trying to set out some recommendations from the perspective of a researcher, an academic researcher sitting in Trieste and absolutely not having any relations to Brussels in this moment, became the whole of Europe presenting it to the population. So in a way, you see that here there was a spin that went in favor to whoever was that runs that website, which is rumored to be close to the former governing coalition, that wanted to present the voice of what was told in the morning as the voice of the whole of Europe. Now, doesn't that happen in other countries too? Yes, of course, there is spin. Yes, of course, there is this kind of narratives being twisted. But I would say that this is indicative, this very benign, spin and this very benign geopolitical framing of something that wanted to be an analysis is indicative of how normalized this is in the Balkans, day in and day out. And coming to get back to those results that I told you about, so basically of Serbian respondents being much more inclined towards China, so not believing so much in Chinese conspiracy theories than other countries, we can really put that in relation with the very favorable way in which the ruling coalition, and especially President Alexander Vučić, has been referring to China over the past months, calling Chinese officials as brothers and saviors of Serbia. So I think that here, this raises some really interesting questions about the framing, the media framing, and also the trust in institutions of citizens towards the regime.
Could you kind of tell us a little bit more about these geopolitical variations? But another thing that's very interesting is that within the same countries, minorities, it seems, can have radically different views from their neighbors. And absolutely the most striking statistics come from Kosovo Serbs, as opposed to Albanians of Kosovo and Albania itself. Can you kind of enlighten us a bit on that element and some of those figures?
Yes, absolutely, Tim. So that's exactly why I mentioned that trust in the institutions might play a role here, because from our findings, which I think it's worth highlighting that they're still preliminary and that more research is needed, but it really does seem that minority respondents, so ethnic minorities within a country, are more inclined in believing conspiracy theories than than the majority respondents. So that tells you something. If what you get from the institutions is something that you do not believe in, and the media are in very many occasions in the Balkans closely linked to the government, to the institutions, that tells you about, I think, a breakdown in the relationship between the minority respondents and the government. So what I mentioned earlier about Serbs being kind of more inclined towards China is actually very interesting, because in the case of Kosovo Serbs, as you mentioned, so Kosovo Serbs believe less in China-related conspiracy theories than their Albanian compatriots. And at the same time, over 90% of them believes in conspiracy theories related to the pharmaceutical industry, and a comparable percentage believes in Bill Gates' involvement in the coronavirus crisis. So there are other interesting geopolitical splits. So, for instance, the Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina appear to be more inclined towards the US, so that might be sort of a long tail of the United States role in the war of the 1990s. And also it is interesting to note that the respondents that are in favor of EU accession are less believing of conspiracy theories than Eurosceptics. So in that sense, there seems to be a reflection also of more right-wing conservative and the Eurosceptic positions in other countries. And I'm thinking, for instance, of Italy in this moment, where the far-right respondents, voters for Lega and Fratelli d'Italia, which is another far-right party, have been found to be less willing to take the vaccine, and also therefore more believing of those grand conspiracies perpetrated against them.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Let's move to our next panelist now. Dejan Jovic, you're now a Professor of International Relations at the Faculty for Political Science in Zagreb. And tell us something about the history of the roots of conspiracy theories in Western Balkan countries. When I was a child here in London, my parents had an au pair girl for me, and as it happens, she came from Montenegro, and she assured me as a child that Tito was a woman. Was that the type of common thing that people grew up with in Yugoslavia? I mean, what are the history and the roots of these conspiracy theories in the region?
Well, certainly not that he was a woman, but I remember when I was a child in the first class of a primary school, the way we were taught about the neighboring countries in order to remember them, and there were 7 to former Yugoslavia, was to remember a word, brigama. Brigama comes from the first letters of all the 7 countries, Bulgaria, Romania, Italy, Greece, and so on and so forth. But the word brigama also means troubles and worries in former Yugoslavia. So the message clearly was that Yugoslavia was surrounded by countries which are actually not necessarily hostile, but the countries that we should be aware of. And in fact, I think it was even more the case that in Albania, another country of the Western Balkans, that kind of attitude that actually the world conspires against them, that actually the isolation is the only solution, and that one should rely on one's own force, was very much part of the ideological narrative. When we add to all this, particularly after 1948, various explanations which put the Soviet Union in the very center of conspiring against anti-Stalinist Titoism, that is former Yugoslavia, and its narrative. I think we then get a combination of nationalism and communism, and I think these both of these two ideologies were occasionally rather paranoid about the world around them. And I think the history is not an electricity. You can't switch it on and off, and then you have a completely new situation. It has a long tail, and it has a long legacy, even after 1990. And then in 1990, what happened was the collapse of regime, the collapse of ideology, and collapse of many identities. People could not continue to be, for example, Yugoslavs or communists or whatever else. They had to redefine themselves. This introduced a huge degree of uncertainty in which people started finding various explanations on why this happened. Just remind ourselves that actually, had it been for the people of former Yugoslavia and Albania, probably we would have never had such a dramatic, radical regime change or collapsing of communism or collapsing of Yugoslavia. Many people sincerely believed that this was all imported from the outside, that actually this was copy-pasted then and imposed on them by somebody else. Therefore, we have hostile others who had actually introduced a degree of uncertainty and brought us in a situation of ontologic insecurity, as our colleague Philip Eidus would said. And of course, collapsing of Yugoslavia also meant collapsing of more or less all post-Yugoslav states. So within them, various ethnic groups started blaming each other, external influences, links of the internal traitors and hostile enemies from the outside, external enemies. So therefore, these were all very fertile grounds for various conspiracy theories. But I will add to this also the third, more contemporary element. Here we are talking of the region that has been defined as a waiting room for membership in the European Union. But the train is not to come. I mean, there is no train that is called membership in the European Union. They have been waiting for 30 years, and many feel that actually what they are waiting is a Godot. It will never come. And why would it never come? Even if, for example, whatever we do domestically we feel was already too much. So, for example, in Serbia, many people believe that, well, you know, not even Zoran Djindjic was good enough to get an offer for EU membership. Therefore, you know, this is not up to us. Whatever we do is not enough. It is about the others. There is a sense that our nation, our state, our people are not subjects in this process, but rather objects. And when you are an object, then you are searching for the subject that is doing this to us. And the latest one, of course, is North Macedonia, in which even if you change the name of a country, that seems not to be enough. Therefore, I think it is perfectly logical that many people actually look for the reason somewhere else and for some kind of conspiracy theories. I mean, I was watching another day a popular TV program on Serbian television in which there was one of these champions of conspiracy theories who invented the concept of auto-chauvinism to explain that people in Serbia, actually collaborate with various conspirators from the outside. And I mean, the title of his remarks that was chosen by the editors on this TV was all conspiracies about Serbs are true. So I think many people, in fact, in the Balkans, due to all these reasons, believe this is the case. And as we said in the report, in fact, conspiracy theories are not based only on lies. They are based on very selective facts, some of which might be true, which then get a twist in order to fit into a story that looks very logical, although in fact, after all, for us, looking from this from some distance is false.
Croatia was not included in this report, but what's your feeling? You know, if Croatia had been, do you think that there would be much different? Because Croatia is, after all, in the EU in chief. I mean, where does Croatia fit, and how does this fit together?
Actually, I rely there, and I think we included this into a report as well, on a study by a colleague of mine, Neboj Šablanuša, who actually did a wonderful book on conspiracy theories in Croatia. And he found in 2011, in one of his surveys, that 93% of the people in Croatia believed in at least one of conspiracy theories, and on average, they believed in 5. Therefore, I think the situation is not much different. However, the fact that Croatia is a member of the European Union has somehow, I think, lowered this kind of, it has actually damaged the production of conspiracy theories, so to say, because now people feel less insecure. They feel that they share the future together jointly with the European Union, and they no longer feel they're not in the waiting room, they don't feel that vulnerable. But conspiracy theories are everywhere, and I think Croatia will be somewhere in between the Western Balkans and the European Union, the central part of the European Union.
Great. Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to our colleague Dimitar Betchev, who's now a non-resident fellow at the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council. But before we do that, I'd like to just to remind everyone, or to tell everyone, because I haven't told you yet, is that if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A function, not in the chat function. We've got quite a lot of people, so I don't know if we'll be able to get through all of the questions, but let's have a few anyway. So Dimitar, over to you. You're kind of like, when it comes to Balkans, well, you're not half in and half out because you're from Bulgaria, so you're kind of looking at the Western Balkans from the Eastern Balkans. So how does it look from your point of view? Do you think that things would be different in Bulgaria? What surprises you about this report? Or maybe nothing surprises you? Maybe you knew that there was a lot of people believing in a lot of crazy stuff already.
Well, you got it. It sounds awfully familiar, and actually dovetails with some previous research I was reminded of what Open Society has been doing for years. That's the Sofia chapter, the Media Literacy Index. I'm not really into their methodology, but their findings basically is that when you compare across European countries, Bulgaria is very much in the same cohort at the bottom of the table together with the Western Balkans and Turkey when it comes to how critically you look at media sources. So I think there's a correlation between that and the percentage of believers in conspiracies. Although I must add the proviso that it's not my discipline here, so whatever I say is bound to be impressionistic. But I want to make 3 points because I've been given the role of a kind of commentator. First of all, congratulate colleagues for coming with this very timely study. And one thing that struck me is, again, the question that Dejan tackled. How much of that is new and how much of that is what we've known about the region for a long, long time? Well, I guess what the new bit here is, first of all, that, of course, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, is isolated from the European Union, but it's very much integrated into the West. And you and I, team, have discussed it over a long period of time, because frankly, many of those theories, they don't originate from Belgrade or from Pristina or from a Macedonian village somewhere in the middle of nowhere. They typically are manufactured in the West, and very often that's also the United States. And they kind of bounce back into the region, and here novel channels like social media are instrumental. So of course they testify to the difference in the Balkans, but also to connectivity. And that was certainly not the case 30 years ago when Yugoslavia was collapsing. So that's my hunch, and I stand to be proven wrong with some more thorough and systematic empirical research about this connectivity piece involved. Secondly, and it's more speaks to continuity, I think what is at play is a general distrust in elites and institutions, which tends to be higher in places with lower social capital. The collapse of Yugoslavia and the withering away of institutions that bound together those societies, the party, the Yugoslav army, and so on and so forth. The prominence of ethnic kin, going back to what Dan had to say about ethnicity becoming a leading bit, but also of familial and networks of friends as a replacement of the missing state institutions, kind of fosters and advances this kind of conspiracy theorizing, because it's all about distrust in whatever you are given from the top down. And the last point I want to add is that the findings of the report really remind me of what we've been discussing with regard to disinformation. That first of all, disinformation does originate from the outside, and the geopolitical dimension, foreign powers, and so on and so forth have been acknowledged in this story. But really, you have to be looking at domestic gatekeepers, because frankly, in the US, you could draw a distinction between mainstream media on the one hand and the kind of bottom-up disinformation / conspiracy theorizing dynamic. Yeah, you don't believe CNN or MSNBC, you tend to believe whatever your neighbors told you or you got on chain email from somewhere, that there's a reptile running the White House and so on and so forth. But in the Western Balkans, I think the so-called official media or mainstream media are very much prone to this conspiracy theorizing. I think COVID might not be the best example, but think about all the front pages Serbian tabloids have been running with regard to Albanians trying to create Greater Albania or Croats arming to invade Serbia. I mean, you get the gist. So this culture of disinformation is very much amenable to the receptivity of conspiracy theorizing. And I haven't done thorough research, but I'll bounce it back to speakers. That's a question: how much of what you find by way of the different themes and motives have actually been reflected not just in people's minds, but also they read it in the tabloids or they saw it on TV. So in other words, the more conventional media, which in many countries are beholden to the power holders of the day, to what extent they are involved in this story.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to you now, Florian. I'm not formally opening questions and answers, but I just happen to have seen from Angelusha Morina from the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, and she's asking a question referencing something that we talked about at the beginning, that people in the Western Balkans are 3 or a certain percentage more liable to be prone to believe in conspiracy theories than people in the rest of the EU. Could you just kind of elaborate on that, or just explain that again, just to make that quite clear? Because this is what I think is most interesting. It's not that people in the Western Balkans believe in conspiracy theories, it's that they believe in them a lot more than people in the rest of Europe. But could you just clarify that, since she's brought that up?
So, I mean, I think, so our survey was conducted exclusively in the Western Balkans, so we have to compare to other surveys done in other countries. So, of course, that is never a perfect comparison. The questions might be phrased slightly differently. The timing is different. So in that sense, we cannot say by a percentage point, but if you look at the available opinion polling in most EU countries, as well as in the United States, the range usually of people believing into the most common COVID-19 conspiracies. And again, this is just a reminder, we just asked about COVID-19 conspiracies. So this is why we asked this question. So to also highlight the fact that these are questions, which the conspiracies exist globally. They're not specific for the Balkans. So we didn't ask anything specific, but rather comparable questions, which are asked in Britain, in Germany, in Poland, and everywhere else, the numbers are dramatically lower. So, the ratio which I mentioned of people believing to some degree or a lot in any of the 5 conspiracies is about just slightly above 77% in the Western Balkans. Where you have these cumulative numbers, they tend to be around 25%. It's not everywhere the same. In Poland, it's a bit higher, but I haven't seen the numbers reach 50% in any of the other studies I've looked at across Europe and North America. So in that sense, it's not a definite answer, but the discrepancy is large enough to be striking so that we can make, I think, a fairly robust claim that they are significantly higher in the Western Balkans than in most other countries where this kind of polling has been done, and definitely in the EU countries where I've seen data on this.
Great, thank you very much. An interesting question. I'm sort of kind of drifting over to the questions because it seems to be a good way to go ahead, because there's some good questions here. Paula Margolis says, did you find any correlation between between belief in conspiracy theories and religiosity, or maybe you didn't study that?
We didn't ask about religiosity, so we can say we asked about, institution support for European integration, trust in media, all this data we have, but not about religiosity in this particular case. I wouldn't be sure that we would find a very clear link, because again, we found conspiracy theories across all age groups, very similar numbers, gender, where people live in big cities or rural environments, whether or not they're well educated or less well educated. So in that sense, they believe in different theories more. So there might be, for example, believing that the pharma industry is responsible for spreading the virus seems to be the conspiracy theory of choice of people with a better education. While the believing in the 5G as the main spreader, or Bill Gates, seems to be more popular among those who are less well educated. So we have these kind of patterns, but still overall, if you kind of combine them, the numbers tend to be very steady across all of those categories.
Great. Tenna, you were talking about the role of the media, but politicians as well play their role. Could you tell us a little bit about that, about politicians spreading conspiracy theories in the region?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in this respect, I think some of the questions that appeared do make a valid point, because officially, at least, no government, no political leader in charge has not been spreading conspiracy theories in the Balkans about the coronavirus, such as Donald Trump in the US has been doing. So there is, it is, this is an interesting point, and it is important to state that the Balkans are not completely, sui generis in that sense. But what is very significant in the Balkans, as I also touched upon earlier, is that in many cases, the government and the mainstream media are associated as being one and the same thing. I mean, take for instance Serbia, where the public broadcaster and all the best read tabloids and the private TV stations that reach out to the biggest part of the population, I think it's probably 70-80%, if I'm not wrong, are definitely, very much government friendly. So it is not necessary, in a way, for the governments to spread these conspiracy theories proactively, because whatever narrative they will push through their speeches will be picked up by the media that are so well read and so well spread among the population. So I think this is an important point to make, that it's not that in the Balkans people are more simple-minded. Absolutely not. As we saw, education is not at all a factor that has any impact at all. It is not that they are in some ways genetically different or even culturally different, but there is this difference in terms of the way the media spread the information. On the other hand, I found very interesting and very also accurate the remarks that Dimitar made about the informality being there to, in some respects, supplement and substitute institutions. So that is absolutely true. So friends and family are the most trusted sources of information. So that is something to take into account. And I think also what Dejan explained about the history of conspiracy theories is relevant, because we must not forget that the Balkans had a very, very tumultuous time in the past few decades. And in many respects, the lived experience of the people across the region is one in which, on a daily basis, there are numerous illogical things that happen in their lives. And I think, that there is an argument according to which what you see in your microcosmos and what you cannot explain because politics is so crazy, because to a certain extent, things do get decided, in a way that is non-transparent. Non-transparency is absolutely, there's an epidemic of non-transparency, if I want to say so, in the Western Balkans, happens then at the macrocosmos. So I think it's kind of natural for people, to reflect their own lived experience in something that happens at a higher level. That said, I think there's still, our brief and our data, they do, I think, offer some explanations for certain questions, but they also raised others. So for instance, how come, the respondents from Serbia, a country that I just described, where, the media are very much controlled in a top-down way by the government, are considerably less inclined towards conspiracy theories than the respondents from Albania, for instance? Is that something to be searched maybe more in the history of those countries, or in other factors? We do not know yet, but certainly, it gives food for thought.
Okay. You've lived in Britain for a long time and elsewhere. I'm going to ask you a quick question. We've got a couple of questions relating to this. I'm not necessarily, I can't name everybody, but you haven't studied this, but is it your hunch that these type of conspiracy theories and the levels of belief in the conspiracy theories are as widespread in diaspora communities as they are at home? Or are the people in the diaspora communities likely to be on the sort of same levels as the rest of the country that they live in? I mean, and if you don't know, then you don't know, but do you have a hunch on that?
No, that's a very good point, Tim. So that reflects also the changes in the diaspora communities lately. So in the academic literature, diaspora communities are said to be communities where time is sort of crystallized and their values are crystallized because they tend to keep in a closely knit group and not so much expose themselves to the rest of the country. But this is, I would say, a bit of a dated way of understanding diaspora communities, because of course the way we're communicating is changing, and also the reasons why people are leaving are changing. So I published a study a few years ago about the political views of diaspora respondents from Serbian citizens in the diaspora, and their political views in relation to the 2017 presidential elections. And it turned out that there is a widespread rejection among the politically active people who have left recently from the country of the current course of the government, and also that they predominantly draw information from the media. So I would say that, in the classic literature, we would say yes, probably, my hunch would be that the conspiracy theories are more widespread. But actually, I would say that the recent dynamics are such that we will see a big a change in that respect as well, and maybe even the tables turning on that dated, I would say, conception of diaspora communities.
Okay, great. Dan, I've got a question here from Louisa Bilashevitz. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but I'd like to apologize in advance because there's a lot of very good questions coming in, which is why I've decided to come quite early to these questions. And she says, I was struck by the comment that the EU accession served to somehow reduce the production of conspiracy theories. And yet the EU is a prominent actor in many of the conspiracies circulating, and not just in the Western Balkans, as a supranational agent, pawn of big business, big pharma, etc. How can we understand the place of Europe in shaping the geopolitical cleavages you found in the study?
Well, I think the point I wanted to make really with Croatia is that it's somewhere in the middle between, I think that's my guess. Of course, we haven't actually done research as of lately in Croatia. Croatia was not included in this. Therefore, I referred to this 2011, when actually it's 93%, as I said earlier, who believed in some conspiracy theories. So I would imagine that Croatia is somewhere in the middle between the Western Balkans, where the numbers are high, and with the figures that Florian mentioned for the rest of the EU countries. I think as we see within the European Union, of course, we have the rise of conspiracy theories and also some other kind of isolationist policies that keep blaming everybody for the fate of their own nation. And again, I think Croatia there is somewhere in the middle. I mean, it's not Hungary and Poland and Slovenia, but you would see, for example, sometimes some of the similar arguments also in Croatian politics. But I would like to come back to 2 points that were raised earlier. One is about religion. I mean, I read recently a just published paper of Siniša Malešević on this issue, in which he explains, in fact, that the first conspiracy theories were based around religious cleavages, and then we had nationalist conspiracy theories, and now we have more global conspiracy theories, which are used very much in order to reinforce nationalist narratives. And that's what we see in this study as well. We see this geopolitical aspect in which, for example, Serbs would rather believe that it's America behind the COVID and the danger that comes from COVID. Whereas, for example, Albanians, although not in the same numbers, actually sometimes in a radically different numbers in Kosovo than in Albania, which is also an interesting fact. They would rather believe that it is China, but both of them somehow try to find the source of this problem somewhere else. And I think this is not completely irrational, I mean, to be quite honest. I mean, again, as I said earlier, I mean, there is a strong feeling that actually we are not subjects of international relations, but rather objects. And you can see this in particular when you compare the figures for minorities, national minorities. They feel even less being subjects in domestic politics. Therefore, they feel that actually somebody else is making decisions for them, and they are here just the objects of some of these decisions. And finally, I think the interesting and important concept that we need to include there is the concept of the victim. I mean, in the last 30 years, we had this industry of victimology somehow in Western Balkans in particular, following the war of the 1990s. And everyone is presenting themselves in their school textbooks and official narratives as being victims, not only in the 1990s, but also victims of the long chain of historical events. I think that narrative is very helpful for developing of particular conspiracy interpretations later on. Because if you are taught that you have always been a victim of the others, both in relation to the war of the 1990s and Yugoslavia and the empires in the past, then of course, this is very helpful that you construct another type of conspiracies closely linked with pandemics.
Great, thank you. I'd like to apologize again because we've got a lot of very good questions coming in. There's no way we can get to them all. This one is like, I think perhaps for Florin, because you were the driving force behind this. From Mehdi Askariye, he says, how can we combat these conspiracy theories? Is it possible to combat them? After all, and then now my comment, we know what to do about COVID. You go and get a vaccine when it's available, but you can't vaccinate yourself against conspiracy theories, or you can't vaccinate the world against conspiracy theories. So, presumably you had an idea when you did this work that there was a problem. You found that clearly there's a problem. So the next question is, well, what to do about it?
Well, of course, that's a lot harder than defining the problem. I mean, I think, a lot of it, what we've talked about is the kind of consistent spread of misinformation across the region by mainstream media. And I mean, this is also interesting, is that, we find that it's not that it's people who consume primarily online media or social networks who are more prone to believe in conspiracy theories. And that's because indeed it's mainstream media who is spreading it. So I think, confronting misinformation, and I mean, I think there was just recently a very good study which was commissioned by the European Parliament, which I think Dimitar was involved in as well, which looked at misinformation in the region, and I think combating that. But the problem is, of course, many of the governments are complicit in it, and in fact promoting it. They might not go out themselves to promote the conspiracy theories, as Tena has mentioned, but they're often eager to have their medias do this kind of priming and sending these messages. And I think in a certain way, the professionalization, reduction of misinformation in the public sphere, I think would go a long way. I mean, and the other point, of course, if we take Dan's point, which I would also subscribe to, is in a certain way, uncertainty breeds conspiracy theories. So you have to restore trust in institutions and restore trust in the processes which provide some kind of certainties. And one of them is European integration. So, in a certain way, European integration, increasing trust in institutions and handling misinformation, I think all of that can deal with it. But of course, this is not a quick fix solution. I mean, you're not going to get the numbers down down for COVID conspiracies. Of course, if the vaccine works, people might then believe that it's in fact all just part of that the whole pandemic was a plot, right? People believe that as well, that this was all just made up. So this is more of a long-term, we're in the long haul for that to confront it.
Dimitar, I'm going to come back to you because there's actually a specific question for you here from Bojan Stojkovski, who says, he's got a specific question from you. After the veto from Bulgaria, the notion among a certain part of the population in North Macedonia is that there are bigger powers, the EU, the US most notably, behind this decision, and that Bulgaria is just the enforcer of the decision. So can we also list these similar notions as the new and emerging conspiracy theories about the EU and the US in the region? I mean, I suppose like viruses kind of develop into new mutations, and this version of COVID is number 19. Are we going to see a kind of new are we seeing in Bulgaria and North Macedonia, a new generation of conspiracy theories?
Well, as I said, the ground is very fertile, but I think the bottom line is the disbelief that local people, governments, politicians have proper agency. It's all up to somebody else far, far away deciding on himself. So it's not about Bulgaria doing something. It's about the puppeteers, and this is a very misplaced mentality. I mean, it really creates this toxic atmosphere where you actually incentivize people to take responsibility to participate in civic life. I think that is the end result, because there's always somebody else making the decisions. It's not you, and it's not your neighbor.
I'm going to read this question here from Theresia Toglofer from the German Council on Foreign Relations. He says, and I'm throwing this out to whoever would like to pick this up. Could you elaborate on what are the main motives of external and local actors in spreading conspiracy theories on COVID in the region? That's a very good question. I don't know who would like to pick that up.
I mean, I can gladly just quickly answer that.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, again, I think it's not that there is kind of like we don't find a pattern of a deliberate, kind of, there isn't a conspiracy to spread conspiracies, right? So we shouldn't fall into our own conspiracy trap. There are actors who have, we've had, Russian misinformation campaigns in the region, spreading certain kind of narratives, and this is often to be disrupting trust in institutions and trust in Euro-Atlantic processes. But I wouldn't say that I've seen them particularly spread by Russia. I mean, and a lot of this kind of doubts is part of the sensationalism, the idea of media to give it a spin. So it's often not that you can detect a deliberate strategy, but it's this kind of constant, low level of quality, low level of also repercussions. If you spread a lie, if you spread in the media, nothing is going to happen to you. You're probably going to improve your readers' numbers, so there's no consequence of misinformation. So I think it's a lot more that than some kind of deliberate strategy. And that, of course, makes it also much more pernicious, much harder to crack in a certain way, because it's not just about one bad guy who's trying to spread a particular narrative across the region.
Let me come in. Great. So coming back to the example that I made at the beginning, in which basically I was in an article published a few hours after my column, I was framed as the whole of Europe saying something and the voice of the European Union. I mean, again, our experience within the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group is also that we are labeled on the completely different side, and by some other actors who have the interest to say that we are, pro-Serbian. We got labeled as that. Florian has had many troubles with, on the other hand, with the Serbian government officials who were labeling him as anti-Serbian at the same time. So my point is that these are all domestic actors, domestic spins that serve one or the other interest. Most of the times they're linked to ruling parties, just because they have more resources and they're more powerful and more able to spin these messages, but not always. And I mean, how does that relate to COVID-19 theories? It does in a lateral way, because if you have, you know, on the tabloids, on Informer, for instance, day in and day out, the glorification of Vladimir Putin. Then also, more recently, Russia was not presented any longer in such a good light, and then back to glorifying Russia. The absolute, glorification of China as the best friends of Serbia, while the EU is a fairy tale. And again, this is a message that was given by President Vučić, who said that the European Union's help in COVID-19 response was a fairy tale, whereas the only one who can save us are the Chinese. So if you have that message from the political top, then clearly, you have also media that are able to disseminate and to amplify your message. The jump from there to the conspiracy theories is very short, because it is enough to create a situation in which the public is more inclined towards one actor than the other for the political purposes of whoever is pushing this spin. And that is reflected in our data of respondents who are more or less inclined towards geopolitically themed, if you will, conspiracy theories.
We're almost out of time, but there's one element we haven't really talked about, so I'm just going to ask it very quickly to one of you who'd like to pick it up. You've talked about public health risk. Clearly, if people believe conspiracy theories and they won't get vaccinated, fine. That's clear and obvious. But what is the threat to democracy? Because you talk about this as a threat to democracy. What does it matter if people believe crazy things, apart from not getting vaccinated? Why is it a threat to democracy? And perhaps, Florian, you'd like to pick it up, or Diane, because you've been close to government, or well, Florian first.
Or very briefly, I mean, of course, if you believe this, first of all, you don't believe in your own agency. So it demobilizes you to become politically active. Your choices don't matter. So of course, you're less likely to participate in elections. You're less likely to trust institutions. So all of that, of course, makes you more likely to be a victim of authoritarian regimes, which actually want people to be passive and not to be active citizens. And then, of course, you're more likely to support parties and actors who actually play to those conspiracies. So somebody who says there's a rational explanation, who kind of gives you a rational kind of evidence-based approach, is less likely to take hold with you than if you are telling a story which tells you that it's big forces to blame for everything and you are going to be the strong man who's going to stand up to them. So that's, I think, the key dangers.
Great. Dan, would you like to pick up one?
I think it's not necessarily a danger to democracy if we bear in mind that, in fact, there we have an attempt to create an anti-elitist democracy, a democracy that in other places we would call populism or something like that. But in fact, here we have a danger that, in fact, you completely disregard the expertise. You actually start blaming experts, including medical experts and others, for being part of the conspiracy, in order to sell medicaments or anything like that. And I think if you undermine trust in rational debate, how can you have a qualified, reasonable decision-making process? And I think that's where we are. We, in fact, are in a situation in which it doesn't matter whether something is founded in some opinion is founded in evidence or not. What matters is that it sounds good and it might be attractive and then popularized by various media. That's a problem, because you can't have a democracy without a rational debate in which you can actually convince the other with the strength of your argument. If there is no possibility of that, then it's a problem.
Great. Dimitar, one word on that? Would you like to say one word on that? We've got literally 30 seconds.
No, I just want to congratulate my colleagues for the excellent job and looking forward.
Thanks. Tena, would you like to say one word on that? The threat to democracy? Your microphone.
Yes. So I would like to launch a new conspiracy theory. So my fashion choices are deliberate. What do you see in this snowflake? I think it resembles very clearly a coronavirus. So I think that Santa Claus may be involved in spreading coronavirus, but I don't know if he's also involved together with Bill Gates. So that's my new conspiracy theory for today. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's great, and I hope that will be on the front pages of newspapers and portals across the Western Balkans within about 45 minutes. I mean, if journalists are really doing their job. I'm joking. Right. Thank you very much to everybody. We really packed in a lot there. The report is great. There's a lot in there. I urge you to download it and to read it. So I want to say thank you very much to my panelists, to Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group for doing the research, the European Fund for the Balkans for backing the research, and the Future Europe Initiative of the Atlantic Council for hosting this. And I'd like to apologize to everybody who's asked lots of great questions, but we haven't got the time. But thank you to everybody, and be safe. Thank you, and goodbye.